All right, let's talk that Houston Texans Kansas City Chiefs playoff matchup. That was an officiating disgrace. We all know it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that unnecessary roughness penalty everyone's talking about involving Patrick Mahomes a little later in the video. But this situation has gotten even worse with the NFL officiating in this playoff game. It wasn't just that roughness call, it wasn't how they handled certain other situations. It was unequal application of the rules in favor of the Kansas City Chiefs against the Houston Texans. Now, look, on this channel, neither of us are Texans fans, neither of us are Chiefs fans. We talk and cover both teams all the time. We think they're both really quality organizations, great quarterbacks, good coaches. So we're not like hating on one team, hating on the other. And look, the Chiefs, they made the plays at the end of the game to handle business and head back to the conference championship game. And the Texans made too many mistakes on special teams. So not taking anything away from the Chiefs and not saying the Texans don't have flaws they have to overcome to become a better team. But the reality is the officials completely changed the outcome of this game. But I want to talk not about the unnecessary roughness side first. I want to talk about the misapplication of holding, offensive holding. And before we get into that, let's pull up those from the rule book here. This is the literal definition of offensive holding. So just from it, I'll read it out loud. For an illegal block in the back above the waist for the offense lasted 10 yards. Okay, that's from a different part of the rule book, but the part underneath that is what matters. He says, use his hands or arms to materially restrict or alter the defender's path or angle of pursuit. It is a foul regardless of whether the blocker's hands are inside or outside the frame of the defender's body. Material restrictions include, but are not limited to, grabbing or tackling an opponent, hooking, jerking, twisting, or turning him, or pulling him to the ground. Again, going back to the top sentence there, materially restrict or alter the defender's path or angle of pursuit. That's what really matters. Materially restrict or alter the path here. Now let's go to two situations here where the Chiefs right tackle, Jawan Taylor, did alter this, did materially restrict. If you pull up, we got two screenshots from the game. You can see there, it's kind of blurry. We're going to switch between both images if you don't mind, but you can see Taylor on the right side of the screen there on one image, just on the left side of the screen on the other, the two different vantage points. He is holding, he's materially restricting the Houston Texans defensive end. Wasn't called. Now look, I don't necessarily hate the no call, but the reality is, if we go to a different screenshot in the game, let's go to the Houston Texans right here. You can see Shaq Mason having his hands just outside the frame, materially restricting. I think that could warrant a call. And in this situation, same ref, same situation, quarterback scrambling to the right, decided to throw the penalty. And I think this is the real problem that people aren't focusing on here. The unnecessary roughness and the favorable treatment of Patrick Mahomes is a travesty. But the reality is we're seeing unequal application of the rules. If one team does one thing and they get called for a penalty, and the other team does the exact same thing with the exact same officiating, but with a different result, that is a problem. You need the same strike zone on both sides. You need everyone to understand the framework that the game is being played. If the Chiefs can do something and the other team can't, it's an unequal advantage. In this situation, to me, holding, while it doesn't get all the headlines and stuff like that of the unnecessary roughness, it's just as bad as an officiating error.
Yeah, Nick, and I think when we talk about holding, it's something that every you hear the adage, holding is could be called on every play. It's something that is in the game for better or for worse, and it happens all the time. And sometimes refs will get into a game and you can see it from the get-go. Like, all right, we're gonna let them play a little bit. This is a playoff game. There might be a little holding here, holding there. If it's not egregious, we'll let things slide and we'll keep the game going. And those are instances where it's called the same for both sides. And usually there's times when they get a little bit flag happy. You say, hey, holding, we're going to call it every single time, and it's called for both sides. Rarely do we see where one team is called for holding consistently and another team is not. I think that this is just, it can't happen. You can, especially with refs, I think the biggest issue is nobody really is worried. The refs aren't worried about the image created for them because there's no accountability for it. But this air of just being able to be favored to one side, blatantly call things one way, but not call them the other way, this is the problem. There has to start to be some level of accountability. You can go back through the usually towards the end of the season, we've done a couple of different videos on the different calls and things that have really been botched the last few weeks. It's gotten worse and worse as the season has gone on, and it's getting to a point where something has to happen. Somebody's got to step up and be able to do something because it's affecting games. I'm not saying that the Texans would have won this game if calls would have gone their way. They'd have to put the players on the field, like you said, not make the special teams mistakes. We're not saying the Packers would have won last week if that first fumble on the kickoff was called not a fumble, if the helmet to helmet was called. We're not saying that they would have won that game. They still have to put the play on the field. But the fact is, it's affecting games is becoming and affecting playoff games at that as well. It's becoming a major issue in the NFL.
Yeah, and it's one of these things I'm going to keep harping on. And as an offensive lineman, former offensive lineman, one of the things that when you're talking with refs, and these offensive linemen are talking to officials, O-line coaches talk to officials before and during games, you just try and get a feel of what they call, right? It's the same thing with DBs, right? If you're trying to, gauge what's defensive holding, what's defensive pass interference, some crews are a little tougher, right? They're more sticklers for rules. Some crews are a little looser. And a lot of times, like you allude to in playoff games, they'll try and let the guys play. But the one thing that can't happen, and we're just going to keep harping on this, is an unequal application of the rules, right? I read the rules there at the very beginning. We saw the images. Literally, right tackle, quarterback scramble to the offensive right, offensive player, offensive tackle materially restricts the edge rusher in both situations. Nearly identical thing. Boom, both saying, I'm sorry, right guard Shaq Mason, in this case, not right tackle. But it wasn't called, right? And this wasn't called for the against the Chiefs, was called against the Texans. This unequal application of the NFL rules is absolutely devastating because as a team, how can you game plan for that? How can you prepare for that? That's an unfair advantage applied to one team against the other. And that's the biggest problem. You can game plan for officials that are really tight on the rules, really loose on the rules. Coaches do, they do it all the time. You can't game plan for unequal application. There's no way to overcome that if it's going to be severe, which we saw against the Houston Texans. Now, look, let's go back to the unnecessary roughness, though, real quick. And let's pull up the NFL rule because I think this is really important here. And this is, again, from the NFL rulebook talking about unnecessary roughness. One of the examples from the top here running, diving into, or throwing the body against or on a runner whose forward progress has been stopped, who has slid feet first or has declared himself down by going to the ground untouched and has made no attempt to advance. All right, and it refers to another section to talk about a sliding player. Here's the critical component here that people aren't talking about. Sliding. When a runner slides feet or head first or simulates sliding the ball is dead the instant he touches the ground with anything other than his hands or feet or begins to simulate touching the ground. Notes, right? This is the key part here. That go to note 3 here. This is the most important thing. A runner who desires to take advantage of this protection is responsible for starting his slide before contact by a defensive player is imminent. If he does not and waits until the last moment to begin his slide, he puts himself in jeopardy of being contacted. It is literally in the NFL rulebook that Patrick Mahomes in that slide situation was wrong. He doesn't get the call, right? Hey, listen, you slid late, you're playing with the game, trying to take advantage of the rule, you're going to get contacted, man, no foul. It's here in the rulebook. This is the part that frustrates me. It's not like it's weird or ambiguous. There are some NFL rules that fans don't like because they're bad rules and they just come up during the game. But if it's in the rule book, right? It's just the way the rule is. It's the way the rule's written. It's ambiguous. It's unclear, right? It's like what the old definition of a catch used to be. It was very ambiguous and weird. And so different refs applied it different ways. This is not the case here. There is no ambiguity. It is clear as day in the rule book. Patrick Mahomes was in danger of being contacted because he started his slide late by trying to take advantage of this rule. It's in the rule book that it shouldn't be a foul, and they call it anyway. And that is the problem, right? We're talking about unequal application of the rules. That's terrible. The other side of it is just completely and blatantly disregarding text written in the rule book. How as a team can you game plan if you're going to get unequal application of the rules like we saw with offensive holding? How as a team can you game plan if the NFL refs are just going to decide in a game, playoff game, that certain sections, note number 3 here, is just going to be completely disregarded? You can't, right? You just can't game plan that way. It's impossible to figure it out. Texans made a lot of mistakes. The Chiefs made some plays in the fourth quarter. Nothing to take away from them there. But the reality is this officiating disaster and inconsistencies and just blatant, just garbage has to stop.
And for me, Nick, the key here is at this point, this specific play, it's not me and you saying it. It's not Texans fans coming out and saying it. It's not even Chiefs fans coming out and saying, well, yeah, that was a little bit of an interesting call. It was on the broadcast. Troy Aikman comes over the broadcast and this is what he says. He says, come on, he's a runner, and I could not disagree with that one more. He barely gets hit. This is the second penalty now that has been called against the Texans. Then they go on to bring in rules analyst Russell Yerk, who buzzed down and signed off on exactly what Aikman said. So, former player, former quarterback, Troy Aikman comes in, says he was a runner. This is someone trying to game the system. It shouldn't have been called. Then a former, NFL rules analyst comes in and says, "Hey, you're right. This is not great." So it's a second example of just unfair application of the rules, and it's gotta stop. It's bad for the Chiefs. Chiefs fans are probably starting to hate this as well because they're not the ones getting the calls. I don't think Andy Reid comes out in there and says, "Hey, don't call penalties on my team this game." It's just something that happens, and I think it really needs to be addressed. It's starting to hurt the game of football.
Yeah, one final point you hit on something there is that everybody hates this. Chiefs fans hate it because it makes the win not as sweet. It takes away, it makes it bittersweet, makes it sour. It puts an asterisk next to it, right? No one wants to see that. Whether you're a Chiefs fan or a Texans fan or a fan of the NFL, you hate the Chiefs, hate the Texans, it doesn't matter. It degrades the product. It makes every win and every loss feel questionable. This is something that's going to hurt the NFL. We saw it in the regular season. We're now seeing it in the playoff games. Something has to happen or real consequences are going to affect even deeper, bigger games.